Perfect. So now that that's done, the webinar is being recorded. All right, amazing. So we are so excited to present you all this webinar. The Climate Reality Project Canada recognizes the importance that youth have on fighting the climate crisis, and that there's also a unique opportunity for young people to reimagine their collective future and create the change that they seek. However, as important as youth activism is, we must always remember that no movement is sustainable when care and compassion is at the center of them. So this is why today we will speak about the impacts that engaging in climate work can have, as well as the solutions to make sure that we are maintaining healthy boundaries and practices within our movements. So without further ado, I will let our amazing speakers take the floor. Today, we are lucky to welcome Jodi Lammiman as well as Mackenzie Harris. So Jodi is an eco-spiritual director, community facilitator, and an artist. So she brings an advocacy lens to all of her work and has mostly recently worked as a community organizer. As a co-founder of Refugia Retreats, Jodi really believes that both system change and personal change are facilitated by creating spaces that recognize the importance of interdependence while working towards change. We are also so lucky to welcome Mackenzie Harris. So Mackenzie has been involved in the movement for climate justice since 2019. A former member of Climate Strike Canada, most of their efforts have related to community organizing, bank fossil fuel divestment, Indigenous solidarity efforts, and climate justice education. Kenzie is currently a part of the Climate Justice Organizing Hub, where she works as a trainer and support person. She also works as the education lead and digital campaigner for Banking on a Better Future. Unfortunately, as you may have seen on our little promotion banner, our last speaker, Tracy Mitchell, will not be able to join us tonight as previously planned, but she sends all of her regrets to you all, but a family situation unfortunately came up. However, we're so grateful for Jodi, who will be able to cover some of the important information that Tracy wanted to share with you all. So enough talking. Jodi, the floor is all yours, and we're so happy to have you with us tonight.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen. And give me just a moment to do that. Okay, great. So I just wanted to start by saying thank you for inviting me tonight to talk about mental health, self-care, and youth activism. And as Daphne mentioned, my name is Jodi and my pronouns are she, her. And I'm calling in from Mohkinstsis on Treaty 7 territory, otherwise known as Calgary, Alberta. And as we start tonight's presentation, I also want to credit Tracy, who, as Daphne said, wasn't able to be here tonight, but has shared some of her slides with us. And so I've incorporated some of that content in as well. So with that, we'll get started. So I want to begin by talking a bit about the mental health challenges in the context of climate justice. We all make meaning of our experiences in our own ways, and for some, labels and diagnoses are helpful, and for others not. So today we're going to focus on some terms that can give us language for how we're feeling, and also on the feelings themselves, something that I hope that everyone will be able to relate to. So for me, some difficult feelings related to climate change include a really deep anxiety, fear, and uncertainty, as well as anticipatory loss over species lost and over just what we're losing in general, and a sense of overcommitting at points, and then also burning out and undercommitting, alienation and disconnection, self-criticism, shame, doubt, and overwhelm. And I just wanted to name those. And I also just wanted to invite you to think about what that feels like for you. So unfortunately, I'm not really able to see the chat as I'm sharing my screen, but please feel free to go ahead and if you want to put in some of the things that you're feeling, or to take that back and reflect on it for later. So I want to start with a few terms. Often when I talk about mental health, I spend a lot of time talking about eco-grief and eco-anxiety. So I'm going to give you a few terms for eco-grief and eco-anxiety, as well as a few definitions. So some of the terms that get interchanged a lot are ecological grief, ecological anxiety, ecological despair, climate grief, climate anxiety, climate despair. Some you might not hear as often are place bereavement, and so that refers to the loss of a place. An example of this might be for folks who are refugees, you might feel place bereavement at having to leave their homes, or for someone who has to make a move suddenly, or let's say if as an adult you're going back and visiting a homeland that you grew up in and finding it really different, or finding the aspects of it have really changed. Another term is topicide, which is the death of a place. And this often refers to a clear-cutting event or a landslide. It can be both natural climatic events, or they can be because of man-made events. And then solastalgia, which builds from solace and alga. And alga means longing, and it's a homesickness while still in place. So it's mourning a place while you're still in it. And that's a term that I really resonate with. And I'll tell you a little bit about my story in a few minutes, and you'll understand. Like, I was in the midst of a clear-cutting event where I lived and really seeing a lot of loss around me. And so that term is dear to my heart. So some of the definitions that go along with this, researchers Consuelo and Ellis say that eco-grief is grief that is felt in relation to experienced or anticipated ecological losses. This is including the loss of species, ecosystem, and meaningful landscapes due to environmental changes. And then social researchers Burton and Christie say the ability to mourn for the loss of other species is an expression of our sense of participation in and responsibility for the whole. And then psychiatrist Ken Doka created the term disenfranchised grief or disenfranchised loss. And this term really describes the type of grief that occurs when a loss isn't approved of or openly accepted or felt by other people. So in Canada, we live in what is commonly referred to by social scientists as a death-denying society. So what that really means is that we struggle with any sort of loss that isn't focused on human life. So loss of a job, the multiple losses we've had because of COVID, and then of course climate grief and climate loss falls into this too. These are losses that we often don't openly approve of or openly accept. And so the widespread denial of climate change losses can often prevent our emotional pain from being acknowledged or validated. Those of us who feel climate grief or anxiety may be told that we're too sensitive or even exaggerating the issue. Or if, like I did, you grew up with a family that's climate deniers, you might actually even be told that the whole issue is not something that you're supposed to feel anything about because it's not true. And that can really create responses that cause us to feel isolated and that cause us to further either deny our own emotions or not share our own emotions, which means we might not seek out the support that we actually need in order to move through our grief. Surprisingly, climate grief is even disenfranchised within communities of climate activists, as well as climate scientists. So even though members of these groups may experience grief, may experience climate grief the most due to the levels of their exposure of the issue, because often we don't have cultures where we discuss our grief or our emotions in scientific and activist settings, many can feel isolated from their experiences of grief, even while surrounded by others who feel the same thing or feel something similarly. So an example I have of this is a few years ago, I was doing an eco-grief facilitation with a fairly well-known environmental nonprofit agency. And after, we got quite a lot of feedback that people felt really uncomfortable because the topic felt very vulnerable for them because they weren't used to having these conversations with their coworkers, even though they were all engaged in climate change work. And so I think this is one of the reasons we really need to be having conversations like this and be normalizing the topics around climate grief and climate anxiety and some of the deep emotions that we feel around a changing climate and climate justice work. So I wanted to share with you this current research that just came out at the end of last year. And it's a research study out of the University of Bath in England. And they surveyed over 10,000 youth ages 16 to 25 from multiple countries. And really what they saw is that respondents were extremely worried about climate change. 59% were either extremely worried or very extremely worried. 84% were moderately worried. Over 50% felt sad, anxious, angry, powerless, helpless, and guilty. And over 45% said feelings about climate change negatively affected their daily life and functioning. So I'm guessing that I'm not telling anyone on this call something that they don't already know or feel in their daily life, but I think it is helpful to have it reflected back to us that we're not the only ones feeling this way and that we do need to normalize these conversations. So what do we do with our grief and how do we attend to it? I think one of the first things is that we need to normalize it. Grief isn't a problem to be fixed. It's actually a very natural response to loss. And the same with anxiety. It's a very natural response to climate change and to what's happening in the world around us. So we need to normalize that and start to validate that in our climate circles. We also need to recognize that there's no right or wrong way to grieve and that there's not a timeline for grief. And a teacher of mine, eco-philosopher and activist Joan Macey, always talks about, I'll talk a bit more about her in a moment, but she always talks about how grief and love are two sides of the same coin. We grieve because we love, and our grief actually shows us what we love. So if we let it, our grief can show us what matters to us. We also need to find supportive groups, whether those be friends, communities, or eco support groups, or the folks we organize with. We need to have opportunities to share how we're feeling and to connect around how we're feeling, because when we do this, we can become less isolated and we can actually move together into action. And action can actually help us move through our grief. So climate action can also have mental health benefits. When being involved in climate justice can cause a sense of solidarity and a connection with the more than human world and the planet, can also cause a sense of felt connection with the folks we're organizing with. And that can help us feel hope as we work together towards change, also responsibility and a sense of empowerment. And for those of you who are involved in climate justice movements, that's a question I want to ask you to reflect on too, is how does your climate justice action help in your mental health? Where does it help you feel a sense of empowerment or connection? And again, I'll invite you, if you'd like to put that in the chat, and I'm looking forward to looking back at those responses later, or to spend some time reflecting on that after. So I'm going to tell you just a little bit about my story. So quite a few years ago, I lived at a retreat center in the Rocky Mountains, or just on the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains in Alberta. And while I was there, so the first two pictures on the right are pictures from like the view of that I had, and the picture on the left is a picture of an active clear cut that was happening while I was living there. So while I was living there, there was a clear cut that happened that essentially they took what they were supposed to be cutting down in 25 years and actually cut it of the whole forest down in 2 years. And it was like incredibly devastating. And a number of our neighbors got together and started to form a group called the Stop Ghost Clear Cut. While I was living at the retreat center, there were 10 of us who lived there. I got involved in the Stop Ghost Clear Cut on kind of a limited basis because my schedule only allowed for certain involvement. But also I was feeling a really deep sense of eco grief, and I was feeling a really deep sense of loss. You could hear the clear cut from where I was living. And if you just drove down the road a little bit, you could see it as well. And my community would not get involved for various reasons. It was a religious retreat center, and there was a lot of beliefs around the importance of industry. And I can really remember really struggling with not having an outlet or a place to actually share my grief, and attempting to do so. And like I even had an incident where a community member kind of chased me down the hall yelling about why industry is good. So the center I was living in was very fraught. And I didn't really know how to process my grief other than to get involved with the Stop Ghost Clear Cut. And so I did. We had them into the center occasionally, but because of like kind of the tension and the controversy at the center that I was working at, I started to have chronic pain, and I started to really feel very isolated. And I started to really question, retreat center should be a place where you can come away and engage in self-care. It should be a place where you can come away and like dig into kind of some of your own mental health and the emotions that are coming up for you, and that be a safe space for that. And it really wasn't that for me. And I started to really question why we don't have places where we can do that when it comes to climate, and when it comes to connecting our environmental concerns with our self-care, and with our understanding the connections between us being interdependent beings and being in the world and connected to it. And so out of the time that I was at the center, Refugia was born. And Refugia is an organization where we try to create spaces for people to work through climate grief and work through other deep emotions together. We're always creating space for individual self-care, as well as looking at communities and systems as well, and bringing in environmental and social justice pursuits for that. And so for me, my eco grief actually became a very real way for me to move into action and move into creating something different. And something that actually really helped me do that during this time was learning about the work of Joan Macey. So Joan Macey is a activist. She's a living systems and environmental scholar. And she's in her 90s now, and she has created a framework called The Work That Reconnects that helps us move through our grief and through our pain for the world and into action. And it has both a systems component of that and a personal component of that. And so I'll be sharing a bit more about her work a little bit later, but this is a frame from her work that I often use in these sorts of settings to kind of talk about the work that we all do in the world. So the reason I want to share this is because we all have different roles, and each of those roles is important to climate action work. So as you'll see on the Venn diagram, climate action is in the center. And then on the right-hand side, we have holding actions. And holding actions are actions that attempt to slow the damage being done to the earth. So some examples of this include political, legislative, and legal work that is required to reduce climate change, as well as direct actions, blockades, boycotts, and civil disobedience. So this is what I think of when I think of kind of traditional activism, or when I think of activism, this is often where my mind goes. So it's things like Fairy Creek and Waysawetin and rallies and protests. And it's really important, but also so is shifts in consciousness. So shifts in consciousness refers to the shifts in individual and collective deep-seated beliefs, philosophies, spiritualities, and perceptions of reality. And so these shifts in consciousness move us into acknowledging our interdependence of all things and our interdependence with the living world. So some examples of this include living systems theory, eco-psychology, deep ecology, any sort of like eco-spiritualities also as well. And all of these hope to shift us from exploitation towards perceptions that acknowledge the interdependence of all things. And then the third, and this is actually where a lot of Refugia's work lives out of, and my work is in shifts in consciousness. And then the third is alternative structures. And so that's analyzing system causes and creating different ways of being in the world, different structures that are necessary in the move towards a sustainable future. So examples in this include conversion to renewable energy sources, co-housing, local currencies, and transitioning away from fossil fuels. And of course, there's lots more examples for each one of these, but each of these is really important in moving towards climate action. And as I said, I want to share this because I think we all have different roles. And it's also really important to remember that people are working on all of these issues and in each of these circles, so that we can also remember that we don't have to try and do it all, and that we don't have to be engaged in everything, because there are people around the world working in each circle. So yeah, so I wanted to share that. And then I wanted to move a little bit into self-care, because I think self-care starts with knowing who we are. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my definition for it, and that is self-care is any activity that protects and replenishes your energy on a regular basis. So it's what we deliberately do to take care of our mental, physical, emotional, and spiritual health. And it's important first and foremost because you matter. As a human who is on this planet at this time in history, you matter. And then also your work matters. Your climate work matters, and engaging in regular self-care through reflection and action can help you recognize when you need to take longer breaks. And it can also help you recognize when you need to reach out for clinical supports like counseling. So I think that when we do self-care, when we understand self-care as a process of getting to know ourselves and being in alignment with our own work and with what replenishes us, then we can also start to recognize when we're being burnt out and hopefully take the breaks that we need. So the first thing I think that's important about self-care, and so I'm going to talk a little bit kind of about like the framing of self-care, and then I'll give a few examples, but I think a lot of us know what the examples of self-care are. So I really want to focus on these three things. So I think it's really important that we get to know ourselves. And I think when we're thinking about practices of self-care, each and every person has their own strengths, their own energy, and their own skills, as well as their own weaknesses and their own capacities. And so it makes it really important to know your own and to know what takes energy away from you and what gives you energy, and to know your cycles and your rhythms. And to do that without shame, because we live in a culture where I think we're often focused on comparing ourselves to others and being compared to others. But what's really important in self-care is getting to know yourself in such a way that you can not shame yourself, but recognize when you're working out of your strengths and recognize what your roles and responsibilities are in the world as well. So the second is to slow down. We need to slow down enough to pay attention to our own needs. And what I really mean when I say slow down is that we need to take regular time out of our day-to-day schedules to notice how we're feeling and to reflect. And so people can do this in many different ways. And I want to recognize that we each have different levels of privilege and different levels of access to slowing down. But I do think that there are ways that each of us can take, even if it's 5 minutes a day, to stop and to reflect on what was life-giving in that day and what was really giving us energy and what was taking energy away. I also think that we really need to slow our organizing down. And so this might be a controversial take, but I think we need to slow our organizing down so that people can be involved in many different ways and at multiple different capacities. I know that climate change is an urgent issue, but I also know that no single one of us is going to fix it on our own. So we need to take the time to build deep relationships with ourselves, our communities, our planet, the folks we're organizing with, because urgency and busyness can burn us out. And when we burn out, it will disconnect us from both ourselves and our organizing. A couple years ago, I was working at a local library, and I kept meeting all these really rad older folks who kept telling me that they used to be organizers or they used to be anarchists, and as I'd talk to them, they would just say, oh yeah, I don't do any of that anymore. And so much of it was because they burnt out and because the cycles and rhythms of our organizing were not such that they could sustain them. So I think we need to slow down. And I also think we need to recognize that we live in systems that actually profit off of our busyness. We're taught that self-care is an add-on or a luxury, like getting your nails done or having a bubble bath. But self-care, like I said earlier, is actually about getting to know ourselves and what our needs are, what our rhythms are, and what replenishes us. It's also about recognizing our boundaries and our roles and our responsibilities to our communities. And it's really my belief that self-care and community care are very interdependent, and that they both need to be a core part of our organizing work, that caring for ourselves leads into collective care. So we really need to make self and community care the core part of our lives and our organizing, because we each matter and because other people matter. And our movements need to be people-centered and relationship-centered. So at the core of them, we need to be creating spaces for people to show up in ways that are sustainable and supporting people in their own self-care journeys. So what helps me stay as well as I can? A few things that help me to stay as well as I can at any given time are regular retreats from the world. So I recognize that's not always accessible to everyone, but I usually try to take a day or two out every couple of months and just go to like a little cabin in the woods. And I typically spend a lot of time in nature, and I read, and I disconnect from social media during that time. I also get into the backcountry quite frequently. So once a year, I'll go on a canoe trip with a few friends, and we'll try to get totally off grid. And that's actually really helpful for my anxiety and my mental health. And then also organizing spaces for people to process their deep emotions together is actually a core aspect of self-care for me, and having people that I can do that with, that I can also share how I'm doing with. Spirituality and meditation is a big thing for me as well. It is really helpful for me in calming my nervous system. and then being involved in campaigns in ways that I can, as well as reading and learning are all things that really help me to take care of myself on a day-to-day basis. And so here are a few examples of self-care practices that you can do. Each of these helps to calm our nervous system and has research behind it around helping us connect to ourselves. But again, like I said, it's really about what connects for you and what replenishes your energy. And something that might for me might not for you, and vice versa. So because of that, and I'm going to just invite you, if you have a chance to maybe take a screenshot of this and then later on to go back and do some reflecting with it. But because of this, I think activities like this self-care toolkit activity can be really helpful, because they can help us start to slow down and think about what helps me feel rested, what helps me feel connected, who are the people in my life that I can go to when I'm struggling, when do I need to seek clinical supports, all of those pieces. And then I kind of want to finish just by talking quickly about self-care and community care. I really believe that they're two sides of the same coin. As humans, we're an interdependent species. So it's important for us to realize that our ability to care for ourselves well impacts how we show up in our communities. And equally, when we care for our communities well, we're also caring for ourselves well, because we're co-creating spaces that are caring and compassionate. And I think that's what we all want. We all want to be part, at least from my perspective, of communities that are caring and compassionate as we do really important work of climate justice together, and as we work together for a better planet. So the way I understand community care, and this is a quote that was taken from Briar Patch magazine, and I have the reference later on in our resources if you're interested. Collective care or community care refers to seeing a community members' well-being, particularly their emotional health, as a shared responsibility of the group, rather than the lone task of the individual. And it recognizes that we live in systems that are interconnected, and that our ability to be well intersects with our community's abilities to be well. So some questions to think about as we move forward. How does our activism contribute to the betterment of all, ourselves included? How can mutual aid and collective care become an integrated part of our climate justice work? And how can welcoming new folks to this work contribute to our own wellness and sense of shared responsibility? As well as how can climate work be more sticky? And so by this, what I mean is, how do we support people that are already involved so that they can continue to be involved? How can this work be sustainable for long term for folks? And then I also think a question I'd like to add as well is just how do we slow down enough so that we have multiple ways that people can access the work that we're doing and be involved in ways that feel non-judgmental, but also feel caring to them, because we need everyone in this work. And then I'll just close with a few resources. So these resources both came from myself and Tracy. And again, feel free to please take a screenshot if that's helpful. So the work that reconnects framework is the Joan Macey framework that I was talking about, and it's something that I facilitate quite a lot. And there's a number of different activities that you can practice both on your own and also with groups that are really helpful in moving through our grief and our hard emotions back into action. The Good Grief Network is a network out of the States that focuses on eco-grief, as does Generation Dread newsletter and a lot of Brit Ray's work. And then there are also eco-grief circles kind of popping up all over the country. So if you don't have folks that you can talk about eco-grief with, I would really suggest that you do a Google search and see if there's something happening like that in your city or in your community. And then there's some resources about burnout and self-compassion with the Fireweed Collective and Who Cares and Burnout and Self-Compassion, and some prompts for thinking about collective care and organizing spaces. And there's some really great questions that come with that. And then the Briar Patch article I mentioned earlier, and then Mutual Aid, which is a book by Dean Spade. So as well, I'll offer myself as a resource if anyone ever wants to talk about any of this sort of stuff. I'm always really happy to have conversations about it. So thank you very much for letting me share tonight.
Thank you so much, Jodi. That was really incredibly interesting, and I just learned so much, and I think those are such important topics that you really covered very well. So now I would love to give the floor, a few minutes for anyone who has questions for Jodi. We'll be obviously continuing with this webinar with Kenzie, who will be presenting her part of the presentation and of the webinar. But yeah, I just wanted to, if you do have questions, please put them in the chat. We'll take a few minutes and we'll have some time at the end as well if ever you have questions for Jodi and Kenzie at the end. But please feel free to write your questions in the chat if ever you have some. Maybe while we're waiting just to see if people have questions, I do kind of have one question for you, Jodi. You mentioned a lot on how self-care and community care is so interdependent, and I think that's so important. And I love the examples that you put on your presentation in terms of self-care, but do you have kind of any example of how you put community care forward in your work?
Totally. Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks for asking. So this is a really simple one, but a lot of times when I'm meeting in a group of folks, I'll start with a check-in, just like, how are you doing today? And where are you coming from? And just really normalize, we're just happy you're here. And like, how do we create a space where we can have these conversations together? And one that I use, which I usually give a caveat for because it's a little intense, but one that I use in groups that I know like relatively well is called MESP, so MESP, and it is, how is your mental health, your emotional health, your spiritual health, however you define that, and your physical health doing today. And so obviously that's just like an entry point, but I think that can be kind of a good entry point into some of those conversations.
Amazing. Yeah, thank you. That was super helpful. Perfect. Well, if we don't have any more questions right now, like I said, feel free to think about your questions if you have some, and we'll be able to address them at the end of our presentation. And now we'll continue with our amazing second speaker. So Kenzie, the floor is all yours.
Okay, let me see if I can figure out screen sharing. Okay, you'll just have to give me a moment, folks, while I figure it out. Okay, I think this is it. Hopefully everyone can see that all right.
Yep.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
I can't see you. Great. So yeah, thanks everyone for having me and for listening to what I have to say today. As was mentioned, my name is Kenzie. I use she, they pronouns, residing in, sorry, I don't know what that noise is, residing in Toronto, which is the Treaty 13 territory, or Dish with One Spoon territory. So I'm here today as a member of the older end of the youth spectrum. So I'm going on 25, so I can speak from personal experience, but also from experience watching activists younger than myself falling out of the movement. Just as an older person, I've watched a number of people just, enter and fall out. So I can speak to that as well. So just to start us off, I struggle a lot too. And I'm somebody who struggles with my mental health to begin with. So before I started this activism, before I was awakened to capitalism, colonialism, white supremacy, all of these lovely things, I was struggling with my mental health. So when I entered this work a few years ago, I already had some sense of how quickly I burn out because of that, because I'm a chronic sufferer of anxiety. I'd been already sort of working on, what activities tend to burn me out quicker, what are some things that I can do to alleviate that. And so I want to keep this in mind moving forward today, just because I think that the skills needed to navigate eco-anxiety and burnout are not, or to do so generatively and in healthy ways, it's not instinctive, and it's certainly not, or at least in the society that we're born into, nor is it widely taught. And so I think just with that in mind, I like to frame it that way because I think that I have almost an advantage as someone who struggles with mental illness, just understanding that not everybody is going to get that experience, and not everyone's going to learn the same way, or not everyone's going to have exposure to that learning. So I do hope that one big takeaway as well from today's discussion is that everyone in this movement is at a different point in their unlearning journey. And so you can apply unlearning to not just these bigger structures, but also unlearning in how we communicate with one another. So when we're unlearning values of capitalism, colonialism, and white supremacy, we're also relearning values of emotional capacity and of care and compassion, and these things that we don't have a lot of in this world right now. So I just think it's important that we understand that we have to be supporting members of our groups together. These aren't skills that we can just sort of practice in our little silos. It's best to be practicing together how we set boundaries and to be holding each other accountable to stepping back for rest and things like that. So just to summarize, it needs to be a collective effort. Oops. So with that sort of intro spiel out of the way, like I said, I can speak from personal experience about how both highly rewarding but also highly draining this work can be. So December 2nd, 2020, I was featured in this article from the National Observer. They did a survey of students across Canada, and they found that yes, a lot of students are really struggling with climate anxiety, and it's really impacting their studies, surprise, surprise. And so I was featured in this article that talked about how climate change is disrupting our generation's mental health. And on the day of the interview, I was very deep in climate grief. I was like total despair. So the quotes that you see on the screen are things like, and I'm sure these are hopefully things that resonate, well, hopefully not, but they probably are. I'm sitting doing my schoolwork and feeling like it's useless because I might not have a livable future to live towards. And then another quote that I said was, I dip in and out of periods of depression, just feeling like this is huge, this is way too big. So I don't know if these resonate, these sort of feelings, or at least the emotions maybe, but I thought we could do a little activity together. I'm just going to exit my screen sharing so I can share this with you all. We're going to do a little Mentee Meter, and I've never actually done it before. How do I stop sharing my screen? So I'm going to share that link in the chat now. If you'd like to go to the Mentee.com, and then on my screen, I will share as the answers are popping up. Again, I've never done this. We'll see how it works out. But you can just include thoughts on anything that comes to mind when you think about the climate crisis and mental health. So it could be like feelings, emotions, experiences. Let me know if anything is not working. So just anything that comes to mind when we talk about this topic. And I will try to share my screen again. Okay. Oh, I don't know if you need a code. There we go. I don't know how long people read, but I can just read some of them out for accessibility reasons. This is a very beautiful layout for some really mostly negative, more negative words, although they don't have to be negative. Uncertainty, anger, hopelessness or hopeless, fear, anxiety, urgent, disasters, oh no, they've moved, scary, movement, hope, depression, motivation. So there's even some more positive words. You can negative, positive, they're all just emotions. Depends on how you move through them. So yeah, I'm sure a lot of these words resonate, probably some more than others on certain days. I definitely have good and bad days myself. So I'm gonna stop sharing that one now. Thank you for entertaining my Mentee Meter activity. Okay. Hopefully this is a smooth transition into the next slide, which is just slowing down for a second. I want to point out that certain people burn out significantly faster in this movement than others. So anybody who's facing any form of systemic discrimination, whether it be for their skin color, whether it be for their ability, so being able-bodied or not, whether it be for their gender, what have you, that's working in our climate spaces, in addition to dealing with these feelings that we just talked about in the last slide, they're also dealing with discrimination and violence. So obviously I can't speak from a lot of personal experience. I can speak from the experience of a person with a different sexual orientation and perhaps for my gender, but certainly as a white able-bodied woman who's a settler, I don't face a lot of it. But I can speak from some peers in the movement that I've watched completely burning out significantly faster and often. They're constantly having to advocate for their needs. They're constantly tokenized inside and outside the movement. They're constantly facing microaggressions, both, again, inside and outside of the movement when they're trying to speak up for their needs. Additional unpaid labor, trying to teach their peers. Also just dealing with grief and fear from events that are happening in the news. I mean, if you can imagine when the resurgence, if you will, of Black Lives Matter happened again, that's going to take an emotional toll on somebody. So I think this is just really important to consider, especially if you are a person of more privilege in our movement spaces, if you can recognize that you have some level of privilege, to advocate for the needs of those being discriminated against. And obviously that's going to come first with listening, but then to advocate for their needs, because it will significantly help decrease the severity, or at least the frequency of how often these people are burning out, because it's exhausting having to advocate for your needs constantly. So just keep that in mind when we're talking about the context of mental health and the climate crisis. So we're going to move to another Mentee thing. So I'm going to pull that up now. You can actually, I don't think it'll let you see it until I do. Until I move it. Wait. Okay. While I work on this, okay. Hopefully this is showing up for you. If it's not, please let me know. Okay. Finicky.
Is it possible to put the link in the chat, Mackenzie, or?
It will be the same link, but I'll put it in there again.
Oh, okay. Okay, perfect.
It's fine. I'll just put it in there again anyways. Oh wait, I can't access the chat one. I've never used this before, so this is a lot of fun.
You're doing great. No worries.
Yeah, so it should be the same one anyways. So I'll talk anyways about what we're doing here on this slide. So one of the most important things to consider when we're thinking about how we foster caring and compassionate movement spaces is, sorry about my neighbors if that's a little loud, how we engage in our relationships. So I'm bringing up the work of Valerie Kapoor here, who describes 3 main components of leading with what's called revolutionary love. So I apply this to, or I try to apply this to my interactions in my climate work. And I find it's really helpful to sort of maintain a mindset that is respectful of yourself, respectful of others, and understanding of the fact that these systems are really complex and that there's a lot of compounding factors that lead people to act in ways that might be less desirable. So there's 3 sort of relationships to nurture. So there's the relationship with ourselves, relationships to others or with others, and the relationship to our opponents. So neglecting one of these areas is going to impact the ability to fully nurture others. And so thinking about that, how do we engage in our climate work? So I'll give you some examples, because maybe you're like, how do I engage with opponents in a way that is healthy? So thinking about, and you could continue to add your thoughts if they're coming to you as you're reading this, hopefully, and if you need further clarification, I will provide, but hopefully if I'm providing examples, it'll help. So when I am not engaging in nurturing healthy relationships with myself, I tend to engage in climate work in a way that is less empathetic. When I'm not engaging, when I'm not nurturing healthy relationships with others, I tend to engage in climate work, which is very one issue focused, so it's less intersectional. And when I am not engaging in positive nurturing healthy relationships to my opponents, and this one might be a little bit need more explaining, I tend to react more emotionally and reactively. So I'm not saying that you need to have a healthy relationship and be conversing all the time with your opponents. Especially like if it's your oppressor, you're not going to have a positive relationship with them. But for your own mental health, interpreting it as, if I can understand that my opponents are also born into this world where there are systemic factors that are leading them to, or that are pushing them to act in a certain way, or that are encouraging them to do so, I can sort of help me to understand where they're coming from a little bit better. And it can also help me to pinpoint where some of those leverage points could be as well. So yeah, you don't have to have obviously a great relationship with your opponents, but considering their humanity can be helpful when we're thinking about leading with revolutionary love, which in turn can help us lead a more wholehearted and compassionate, leading compassionate spaces. Does that need further explaining? Does anyone have questions about this concept? I'm not seeing a ton of answers, but there are some really good answers here. I'm not hearing anything, so I'll just read that. I think we project our own issues onto others and live into white supremacy and colonialist mindsets. And I really want to highlight that one because that is exactly what happens in our movement spaces. We often just repeat capitalist, colonialist, white supremacist values that are overworking and competitive, and we're not thinking about fostering these relationships like that 3-circle diagram that Jodi just pointed out. We're not thinking about that shift in that sort of paradigm shift, that mindset shift as intently. Burning myself out, I think that others are judging me and I judge others, right? You're more confrontational and you're in silos, so you're not really connected with others. Yeah, I think those are great answers, and absolutely tends to be the type of reaction that I have when I'm not thinking about how can I nurture my relationship with myself, others, and then just also a more transformative relationship with my opponents. So I'm just going to move on to the closing slide, the last slide I have for y'all.
Kenzie, I don't know if we're not seeing your presentation right now. I don't know if you wanted to kind of reshare your screen. No worries.
Oh no, did you see that? Hopefully, I don't know why I did that. Hopefully you saw the answers.
Oh, I think you reading them out was perfect. But
okay, fabulous. Okay, well, anyways, you didn't miss much. Okay, that's my bad. Here we go. This is my final slide anyways, so just some closing general tips to sort of summarize everything from a content organizer that has experienced burnout many times. So setting strict boundaries in your organizing, such as what is your current capacity, and updating people if it changes, because it's probably dynamic, especially if you're a student. Not saying yes just because you have time, not answering after a certain time. So actually setting a time where you will not answer your Slack or your email or whatever you're using to message. Not taking on rushed projects, unless absolutely necessary. So sort of giving yourself a timeline which you will not say yes to your project. Taking the time to navigate conflict to ensure that you are navigating it in a generative way instead of letting it fester and ignoring the conflict. So all of those skills, again, to be clear, are things that need to be practiced as a group. It's not something that just one person can take on. Doom scrolling, don't do it, or at least try to minimize it. Specifically the news that you're consuming. This has been obviously a lot harder probably for a lot of us with the pandemic. We're a lot more glued to our devices. So set a timer or notification on your phone. Do whatever you have to do to step away, silence your phone. You'll be significantly more clear-minded. Don't think that you need to know everything about every single climate issue at all times. Number 3 is just support your team members in practicing these habits. So care work is climate work. And again, we come into this work with different levels of knowledge when it comes to relationships and emotions and navigating difficult feelings. So we need to be taking care of one another as team members, and doing that is climate work, because if we burn out, then we're not able to do the work. So give each other breaks, check in on each other, build these skills that not everyone has when they come into this movement. Number 4, find a community. I think Jodi mentioned this one, whether inside or outside the movements, we're social beings. We cannot just go it alone. And then 5 is obviously take breaks. And then Jodi mentioned this as well. Do it reactively, sorry, not reactively, but preventatively, so that you are not constantly breaking down and then giving yourself a break. It just feels better. So that's all I really have for everyone. I will stop sharing my screen now.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Kenzie. That was super helpful. And I really like the part where you mentioned, how to engage when you're not nurturing healthy relationships. I think it's good to kind of see the both sides of it, and not just when you are engaging in nurturing, healthy relationships. So thank you for that. I think that was really interesting. And again, I'll open the floor for questions. And you can just feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll answer any questions that you may have. And I do have another question for you, Kenzie. When you talk about kind of boundaries and to make sure that we're respecting a schedule and all that, and that might be a difficult question, but how do you make sure that people within the movement will respect those boundaries? Do you have any tips as to once that you set that up, how do you make sure that you continuously kind of maintain those boundaries?
That's a really good question, and it's really challenging. And I also, I will say that you get a much more positive reaction from young people. Young people are usually a lot more understanding when it comes to boundaries and things like that, because we're more enthusiastic to try setting boundaries and things like that. It's usually more like pulling teeth to try to teach that to the older generation. So if you're communicating with people who are older and maybe don't have experience with setting boundaries, it's definitely going to be a different approach, where you are going to upset people, and it's just going to have to be okay. You're just going to constantly have to reinstate those boundaries and reinstate why you have those boundaries, and sort of just make a really clear elevator pitch as to why, and just to keep repeating it. But usually when it comes to younger people, I find that if you just update people, they're just understanding. They just understand, because we're all in school. We all have so many obligations going on, that if you have to push a project, generally people are understanding. So what we've done in our groups is that we use Slack, but whatever messaging platform you're using, hopefully you could find a way, but we put our little capacity, which changes. So we'll put 1 to 5, if my capacity is a 1 today, then don't bother me. If it's a 5, then go ahead, ask me any question that you want. So I think as well as having my own sort of practices that I use, I also try to incorporate those in the groups that I'm in, so that we're all practicing them and it's not just the responsibility of one person.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah, that's super helpful. I think, the idea of putting a 1 or a 5 is really helpful, and it helps, having a better idea of how everyone's feeling and not pushing anyone's buttons. So I think that's a great idea. So thank you for that. Any more questions? I guess we're not getting too many questions because everything was so clear. So if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, and I'm sure Jodi and Kenzie will be more than happy to answer them. Yeah, I don't know if you're seeing the chat. We've had a question from Larry. He says, great presentation. I'm thinking about starting a climate conversation group, and I was wondering how we can create a supportive space where members can talk openly about their feelings. So either Jodi or Kenzie, feel free to answer that question.
Sure, maybe I can jump in, and then Kenzie can jump in as well if if that's something. But so I think that's a great question. And one of the things that I think a lot about when I'm starting a group is what are our agreements for being in the space together. So typically, like, I'll start a group with like actually a group activity where people can write down, or we'll bring a few different groups of agreements. So agreements are essentially, no one likes to call them rules or boundaries, or so we just talk about them being ways that we want to be in the space together. And that is like a good way to kind of set the tone. And then I would suggest, like, if you start a space kind of saying, okay, here's the content, like we're gonna talk about emotional health and mental health as well as climate organizing, like bringing that right in from the get-go is way easier to normalize those conversations moving forward. And I would just recommend that Dean Spade book on mutual aid. They actually give some really great tips for how to start a community spaces together and organizing spaces together.
Perfect. Yeah, Kenzie, did you want to add anything to that?
I guess the only thing that I would add, just in the context of the pandemic, if you're doing this online, make sure you spend a lot of time getting to know one another, because it's a lot harder to gain that trust so that you can have like actually meaningful conversations when you're online and you're not able to meet in person. So I mean, hopefully your group would have a chance to do so if maybe like soon. But just important to keep in mind, because people aren't, they simply won't share their feelings with a group of people that they don't know. So if you have to spend, like 2 sessions just getting to know each other before you actually get into a conversation about the climate, then that's fine. Yeah.
Yeah, those are great points. Yeah, and then I'm just seeing a comment that says, I like what you said, Kenzie, about the generational differences. I think older folks can learn a lot about setting boundaries from younger people. Amazing. So I'll leave just another few seconds for any other questions, and then we'll wrap it up. All right, so I'm not seeing anything new, so I think we'll leave it as that. But thank you so much, Jodi and Kenzie. I think that was really super helpful, and I already feel kind of regenerated only from this webinar. So I hope that participants that listen to you tonight feel the same way. So thank you so much, and wishing a great night to everyone who was here tonight with us. All right, bye bye everyone.
Thank you.
Bye everyone. Thanks for coming.